I had just turned 23, and I was living in a small apartment on the top floor of a house with my two friends Mark and Larson. We had moved in a few months earlier, and it seemed like a good deal at the time. The rent was cheap, and the location was decent. However, we quickly realized that our living situation was far from perfect. The couple who lived on the ground floor, Sean and Claire, were a constant source of frustration. They were in their early 30s and seemed to be drunk almost every night. They would argue and yell at each other at all hours of the night, and it was almost impossible to get any sleep. Mark had tried to talk to Sean one time, asking him to be quiet, but he got really angry and told us to mind our own business. After that, we tried our best to ignore them, but it was tough. I invested in a good pair of earplugs, but it was still bad. This went on for a while. I would run into Sean and Claire from time to time, but they were incredibly unfriendly. I guess they were still mad about Mark. I got a bad feeling from Sean. He seemed dangerous, and I was actually kind of afraid for Claire's safety. I told myself that it was none of my business though, so I tried to ignore them. One night I woke up in the middle of the night. Not unusual for the reasons I explained before, but this was different. It was a loud crash coming from the front of our place. It was like the door had been kicked in. I was pretty sure someone was breaking into our apartment. I quickly got out of bed and walked to my bedroom door. I opened it a crack and peeked through to the living room. That's when I saw Sean standing there. He was in his underwear, and he was holding a gun. I looked for a few seconds. He was fighting to stand up straight, obviously drunk. I quietly moved back from the door and closed it, hoping he didn't see me. I grabbed my phone and called the police. When they arrived, Sean was still in the living room. He was yelling incoherently, but he had put the gun down before the police arrived. Probably the smartest thing he did that night. The police officers arrested him. After that night, we were all really scared. We were wondering if Sean would try to get back at us. We talked to the landlord about the situation, and he seemed concerned, but gave us some non-committal promise, like, "I promise I'll look into it," or something like that. Lucky for us, Sean was kept in police custody for a while. A few days after the incident, Claire moved out of the house. We still don't know why. My guess was that she was too embarrassed to stay. Understandable. We talked to the landlord after that, and he told us that they broke the lease. About a month later, a group of international students moved in downstairs. We didn't hear a sound from them the entire time they were there. Looking back on that time, it's hard to believe that it all happened. It was scary and creepy. We never found out what happened to Sean. Mark said he was only charged with a misdemeanor, or something minor like that. It seems wrong to me. The guy broke into our place drunk with a gun. How is that not a more serious offense? I just hope I never see him again. I moved my family to a new city a few years ago. I got a new job that let me work from home, so we chose a neighborhood based on price and quality of the schools. My kids were 2 and 4 years old at the time, so we didn't have to uproot their lives or anything. It was the right time to make a move, and we found a nice house in a residential area that was not too far outside of the city. On one side, our neighbors were a retired couple that had been in their house for decades. They were nice enough, but kept to themselves. No problem for us. I think a number of the other neighbors were retired as well, but one of our neighbors on the other side of the house were a group of college guys. They offered to help us move some boxes when we first moved in. The college was about a 25-minute bus ride away from our place, so I was surprised when we found out that our neighbors were students. We bought the place knowing that, though. We came to regret it eventually. The first weekend when we were there, they threw a loud party, and we could hear thumping music from our bedroom. I got out of bed and looked out the window. There were people in the front yard and on the street partying and drinking. I couldn't believe they were able to do that without any of the other neighbors calling the police. My wife thought that some of the elderly people were hard of hearing and better able to tolerate the noise. It was loud though, so loud that you could feel it. We tolerated the noise that night, hoping it would be a once-off thing. But a few weeks later, they had a particularly loud party. We could feel the vibrations from their speakers and shouting from our bedroom. At 2 a.m., I had enough, and I decided to go and ask them to tone it down. I walked over to their house, trying to keep calm despite the loud music. I think it's fair to talk face to face before calling the police, especially because the guys had been generally friendly so far. I walked up to the house and knocked on the door. One of the guys opened it. He had a red plastic cup in his hand. I asked him politely to turn down the music. He shrugged and said,
"Why? It's a party."
I explained that the noise was keeping my family awake, but he just laughed and said,
"Tough luck, buddy."
He was clearly drunk. As I turned to leave, one of the guys made a crude comment that made me turn back around. I was determined not to let them disrespect me or my family. I know I should have let it go, but I got angry and walked up to him. "What did you say?" I asked him, my voice steady despite the adrenaline.
"You heard me, old man,"
he said, puffing out his chest. I knew I had to leave before things got ugly, so I turned around and walked back to my house. I was angry and frustrated, but I tried to let it go and get some sleep. Things were awkward after that. I didn't talk to them again for a week or so. I had been busy working at my home office, and I didn't see them much. On another weekend, the party started again. This time it was even worse than before. They had brought in a DJ, and the music was blasting so loud that I could hear it like I was right there at the party. This time I called the police to report a noise complaint, hoping they would take it seriously. When the police arrived, they asked the guys to turn down the music, but as soon as the police left, the music got even louder. It's as if they were doing it on purpose, just to spite us. We called again, but this time when the police came back, they had turned it down before they got there. I think they saw the police coming and turned it down to get one over on me. A few days later, I noticed that our house had been vandalized. Eggs were splattered all over our porch, and my wife's flower pots were destroyed. I was shocked and scared. It was clear that they were targeting us. The following week, we started to get prank calls in the middle of the night. Around that time, we started receiving threatening letters in our mailbox. Things took an even more serious turn one night in late October. It was the night before Halloween, and our neighbors were having a relatively tame party. At around midnight, we heard a loud crash coming from the front of our house. I was still working in my office, which was in the basement. I ran upstairs to the sound and saw that someone had thrown a brick through our window. I called the police. We had security cameras installed after the vandalism incident, so we had footage that covered most of the exterior of our house. Upon checking the video, it was clear that one of the guys had thrown the brick. His face was there, clear as day. The police arrested the guy responsible, and he was charged with vandalism and destruction of property, as well as making threats. We were relieved that he had been caught, but we were still living next to the other guys. They had no respect for our property or our peace of mind. It was clear that we needed to take matters into our own hands. We decided to talk to the landlord of the house next door and see if he could do something about the constant noise and the behavior of his tenants. The landlord was aware of the situation, and he had been receiving complaints from some of the other neighbors as well. He had warned the tenants before, but they had not changed. He assured us that he would take action and deal with the tenants. Eventually, we noticed that the guys were no longer living in the house. The landlord evicted them for breaching their lease agreement. We were thrilled that we could finally enjoy some peace and quiet in our own home. As we settled into our new life without the bad neighbors, we made an effort to get to know the other families on the block. It was a really bad experience. My wife and I were concerned for our children. We were lucky that things didn't go farther. When I was younger, a scary incident happened to me and my two friends Will and Jim. It was summer vacation of 2006, and we were in the 7th grade. Will lived a few houses down from me, and Jim was about a half-hour walk away, or about a 10-minute bike ride. The three of us would spend most days together in the summer, just walking around the neighborhood, maybe seeing a movie if we had the money. Our neighborhood was pretty safe. We didn't know all of our neighbors. I pretty much only knew the people who had kids around my age. There was one guy who lived on my street that was really creepy though. He was a strange man who lived a few houses down from Will and me. His name was Gary, and he was quiet, kept to himself. We rarely saw him leave his house. He was not that old, maybe around 60 if I had to guess. His appearance was extremely shabby. He had long bushy hair and a wild beard. There was something off about him. I remember seeing him staring out his window at the kids who played on the street, and it made me feel strange. He would never say anything, but I could always feel his gaze on me. One day, Jim, Will, and I were on our way to the corner store to buy some candy, one of our standard summer activities. It was a hot summer day, and we didn't have anything better to do. We decided to take a shortcut through Gary's yard, which was overgrown with weeds and looked abandoned. Our parents always told us to stay out of Gary's yard, but we did it anyway. Sue me. We were about halfway through when we heard a noise behind us. We turned around, and there was Gary, standing on the edge of his yard. His eyes were wild, and he was waving his arms around like he was trying to scare us off.
Get out of my yard,
he yelled. We turned around and started to run, but Will tripped over a rock and fell. Jim and I kept running, and we turned back when we got to the street. We thought Will was just behind us, but I was wrong. I looked back in disbelief and saw that Gary was dragging Will by the arm towards his house. Jim and I didn't know what to do. We were scared, and we didn't want to go into Gary's house, but we knew we had to get help. We ran to my house and told my parents what happened. They called the police right away, and we waited anxiously for them to arrive. When they got there, they found Will tied to a chair in Gary's kitchen. Will told me that the place was an absolute mess. There were old newspapers and trash piled everywhere. He was only in there for a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes, but he said it was the worst experience of his entire life. He had no idea what Gary was going to do to him. Gary was arrested on the spot for kidnapping, but unfortunately, he wasn't charged. Some technicality about the fact that we were on his property was the reason he got off. I get that we shouldn't have been there, but if what he did wasn't a red flag, then I don't know what is. That guy was dangerous. We were all terrified to be in that neighborhood, not just me and my friends. After that, things were not the same on our street. Parents kept a closer eye on their children, and we were all scared to go anywhere near Gary's house. We would still see him staring out his window. It was a really bad time. A few months later, Gary moved out of his house. We were all relieved that he was gone. It wasn't until later that we heard that his kids had put him in a retirement home. I guess they heard about what happened, and they were concerned. Credit to them for stepping in before something really bad happened. My name is Andrew, and my wife's name is Katie. We moved to a quiet suburban neighborhood about 15 years ago. We found the perfect house on a nice street. It was farther out of the city than we were used to, but we were looking forward to it. This was before we had children, and we were looking for a place to start a family. When we first moved in, we met some of the neighbors. They were mostly older, but nobody that we really clicked with. But there was one neighbor that we never quite got along with. His name was Frank, and he lived 2 doors down from us. From the moment we moved in, he made it clear that he didn't like us. He would give us dirty looks whenever we saw him, and he would also make remarks about us to our other neighbors. One of our other neighbors, Travis, didn't get along with him either. He warned us about Frank early on, and it turned out that Travis was right. At first we tried to ignore him, thinking that maybe he was just having a bad day, but as time went on, his behavior became more aggressive. He would park his car in front of our house, blocking our driveway, but he said casually that he would be back in a few hours, as if it was a normal thing to block us in for hours. He would also let his dog bark loudly early in the morning and late at night, waking us up. We tried talking to him about that, but he just brushed it off as well, saying that he had the right to do what he wanted on his own property. We felt like he was trying to bother us, trying to provoke a reaction out of us. We talked about it, and decided not to give in to our urges to fight back. We didn't want to give him the satisfaction. Then, things started to escalate. Katie was home alone one afternoon. I worked weekends, and she would be home alone most of the time. One day when I was at work, Frank tried to break into our house. She had just finished taking a shower and was getting dressed when she heard someone trying to force open our back door. She looked out the window and saw that it was Frank. He was slamming into our door in broad daylight. Katie said that he looked up and saw her watching him. When they locked eyes, he stopped and started shouting at her, accusing her of poisoning his dog. There was absolutely no way that she did. If anything, maybe it was one of our other neighbors who he was harassing. This guy had problems, and we weren't the only ones who didn't like him. Katie was terrified. She could hear Frank's footsteps outside, and she knew that he was determined to get in. She barricaded herself in our bedroom and tried to calm down. She called the police, but he took off before they arrived. Since she didn't think fast enough to get a recording, it was his word against hers, so they couldn't do anything. After that incident, we decided to move away. We didn't want to let him win, but we decided that we couldn't allow our future children to grow up around that guy. We sold our house at a loss, but it was worth it. We had to get out. It took us a few months, but we eventually found a new home in a different neighborhood. We packed up our things and said goodbye to our old life, hoping that we would never have to experience anything like that again. Looking back on that time in our lives, I still feel angry. We had moved into that neighborhood with such high hopes, but in the end, we were forced to leave because of one person's problems. As for Frank, I don't know what happened to him. We obviously never spoke to him again after we left. I don't really care to know. All I know is that we're happy to be safe in our new home, surrounded by people who care about us, and a sense of peace that we never had in our old neighborhood.